Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in a first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Okay, welcome everybody to the show. Today we're talking about one of the growth levers for retail, which is retail site expansion, market expansion, specifically site selection. And I am joined here by Andrew Neelon. He's the founder of OneRec. He puts out a ton of great content. It's how I found him. He's also the SVP of Development Strategy at Elase Med Spas. One cool thing about his background is he spent 5 years at Bonobos, where he helped them move from e-commerce to a brick-and-mortar strategy. So, Andrew, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
When I think of you, I think of kind of like a spreadsheets, brass tacks, open up the map kind of guy. Where did you start developing this muscle? Was it while you were at Bonobos, or did it happen before that?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both, but with a big spark, I would say, at Bonobos. Candidly, I never thought that I would fall into site selection or real estate. I just wanted to work at Bonobos at the time, and that happened to be the job that was open. And after I got it, I started thinking, okay, I should probably figure out how to do this job now. And a lot of the content that I put out now and the frameworks and strategies is really because as I was learning this industry, there was just nothing out there to learn. And so the way that I kind of bridged the gap from having a job that I actually didn't really know how to do was, well, I better get really good with data and use numbers to explain my opinions and my perspectives, because I have zero experience to actually come up with those otherwise. So spent a lot of time, first couple of years at Bonobos, just literally downloading monster CSV files of spreadsheet data and just mining it to find patterns and trends, and that's kind of turned into a lot of the frameworks I build and talk about today.
Well, can we talk about OneRec for a second? Because we have a lot of listeners that are D2C, a lot of them are retailers. What is OneRec, and when they go there, like what kind of information can they find?
Yeah, so OneRec is, I've kind of changed, candidly, what the acronym stands for, because it's evolved, and kind of the latest iteration of it is a retail expansion collaboratory. And so the idea is basically, much like the position I was in when I joined Bonobos, for those who are eager to understand how to expand in brick and mortar but don't know where to start, don't know who the right vendors are, don't even know which vendors you need, or how long things take or how much things cost. What I've been building with OneRec is really a platform of tools, templates, guides, and a lot of structured resources to help brands go from 0 to 1, and then scale from 1 to 100 and beyond. So really with the intention of helping to educate, create a little bit more information transparency, and just help people figure it out.
One of the things I've just so appreciated about the OneRec content is I feel like a lot of the content around market analysis, site selection is a bunch of SEO loaded keyword bullcrap, and it tells you absolutely nothing. And when you go on OneRec, it's like you are actually thoughtful about it. So thank you for being a shining voice in the industry, man.
I've enjoyed doing it.
I wonder if you can take me back to Bonobos and how they evolved from D2C to taking this brick and mortar strategy. Like, what was the thinking, and then what role did you play in that?
Yeah. So the genesis of it was before my time. I joined at store 19, I believe. But the kind of evolution of the story was, they were one of the first digitally native e-commerce brands to really be born and on the internet. And as time passed, I believe the story goes that they kind of used their office as a place for customers to kind of check stuff out, but it wasn't intended to be a store in the beginning. And as time passed, they realized, okay, people do actually still want to touch and feel product before they buy it over the internet. Yes, people will buy it over the internet, but there are definitely some perks to still having in-person shopping. And so they slowly kind of rolled out a few locations a year, and then by the time I joined, they had 19, and they had kind of the beginnings of a program, but still very much startup scrappy mode. And so when I joined, I was there to continue the expansion, continue site selection, and over time, really built it into what I would call like a more formal structured program, where we had pretty strong governance, we had pretty strong budgets, pretty good process and timelines, and we were a pretty well-oiled machine. And I think at our peak opened about 20 in a year, seamlessly, but with a lot of hard work. Yeah, and then was there for 5 years before, during, and after the Walmart acquisition, and then pretty much copy pasted that playbook across Walmart's entire digital brand portfolio. So it's kind of a nice little playground for me to see, is what I did at Bonobos just going to work there, or can I actually replicate this? And had the fortunate experience of being able to copy paste and iterate across a number of different brands in a very short amount of time.
So they had in their office. They had like a retail store. Did I catch
Yeah,
that
and
right?
their current, I'm not sure what it is today, but on 25th, between 5th and 6th, is where they used to have, or maybe still have, their headquarters. And that was their first location, which, for anybody who's thinking about where to put store number one, honestly, if you're assuming you're in a major metro area, putting it in your headquarters is one of the best ways to do it for a very long list of reasons. And fortunately, they were in a very good area on 25th and 6th.
But yeah, I know you weren't there because you came at 19. 19 is a really good number to come in, by the way, because there's just enough structure, but there's a lot of
Yeah.
mistakes that you can still make and learn a lot of those things. Um, what was the math to go from one, which is just our office, to store number two? Like, who had the conviction, and why did they have that conviction? Because, I mean, at this point, especially like social advertising was still cheap. It's not as much anymore. But
Right.
like, what were they thinking?
I wasn't there at the time, but they just looking at their history, a lot of their earlier locations were pop-ups, and that's a pretty common strategy that new brands use today. Dipping their toe in the water, and also mature brands use to kind of test out a market before they open a long-term store. Lululemon is kind of notorious for doing that, or at least used to be. And so, I mean, the general thesis of it is that these things just crank. And these are cash machines. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get out of the initial investment and pay it back. But once they do, they're just cash flow machines. And so, especially with pop-ups where the rent is usually cheap, they're built out pretty scrappy, and you're kind of supporting it with a scrappy staff that isn't there to make a ton of money, but to support the mission. You've got a pretty low cost structure that's low
Hmm.
commitment, and especially if you can find a place that's move-in ready, then you're only talking about tens of thousands of dollars instead of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, the unit economics on brick and mortar retail are a lot stronger than people think. You just got to make sure you're measuring it with the right criteria.
Yeah, we'll get to that criteria and the unit economics later, because the way that you think about it is very different, and it's kind of inverse on how most people will think about it. Can we talk about locations that you've opened that you didn't expect to be a huge winner and that just killed it? And then what was the reason behind that?
Yeah, yeah. The example I always like to use is the Shea in Washington, D.C. And for so many reasons, not the least of which is I think it was the best illustration of the power of e-commerce data. So the biggest variable, or, the variable that I've historically used that is the most correlated with a new store's success. It's not demographics, it's not competitor sales, it's not all the other metrics that people tend to use, but it is the amount of e-commerce business you're already doing in the 12 months leading up to opening. And so with the Shea, what we saw was we already had a store in Georgetown and Katie's Alley, and I believe this was number 2 in the actual DC area, and we had 7 figures worth of e-commerce sales happening within, I think, a mile radius of the Shea, which is in the Shaw neighborhood. And it's super. What I love about that stat is that, number one, it just shows that you can get really precise with where your customers live despite an e-commerce channel being digital, right? At the end of the day, people are still rooted in physical geography. And secondly, back then, this was, I think, 2015, 2016, the Shaw was not a great place to be. There's close to some nightlife. I would compare it to kind of like Lower East Side or Alphabet City in New York City. But it was not a place that most people would think, oh, Bonobos would do really well here. But because we saw all of this e-commerce business already being generated there, we were able to, number one, see that our demographic does in fact live there, and number two, it's growing really, really quickly, and number three, the real estate environment has not yet reflected that growth of that demographic yet.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to get in super, super cheap rent. We were one of the first to sign in that particular building. And we had an enormous amount of conviction because we saw our brand awareness is already so insanely high in that particular pocket. And it, to this day, I believe, is still one of the most profitable locations in its portfolio. What I also love about that is a friend of mine who works in, or used to work in real estate private equity, he used to tell me that he loved when he saw one of our stores or heard of us signing a lease in kind of a questionable neighborhood, because he trusted that we had done the research, our demographic is there, our data shows us that objectively, and he just loved to see it to add a little bit of extra conviction that somebody's doing a lot of geographic kind of homework on that particular area.
You said you saw that your demographic was growing. I mean, were you using Esri's demographics to see population growth in that area? How did you know that?
No, this was before I even knew what Esri was. So we basically we worked with a real estate partner to take all of our addresses of the shipping addresses of all the e-com orders, append it with lat long coordinates, and I had them do this over like 2 years worth of data. And then I would just upload it into Tableau, draw a radius ring around it, quantify it, change the time, do the same thing, and just see the growth
Oh my
rate.
gosh, yes.
So insanely manual. We didn't have the budget to use a tool like Esri or some of the other more sophisticated ones at the time. And again, this was before I even knew this world existed. I was
Yeah.
so fascinated by it.
You were out ahead of the census in that case, and all you were doing is you were plotting your customer data, latitude, longitude, and a radius, and then you were looking, are we getting more customers? And so that you I guess you could see that as our brand increasing awareness in this area, but you could also look at it as are there new people moving in? And you probably didn't know which one of it was. It didn't matter. The math was there. Those people were there.
Yeah, and what I think is fascinating, and I spoke about this at a different panel, but I think there's this really interesting world of D2C data monetization for developers, where if you think about, like, you can see gentrification into a new neighborhood before anybody else can, and you see it objectively with data, and then using all these different segmentation tools and things like that. Like it's fascinating what you can see before others do, and the Shaw location that we opened was just the literal perfect example of that.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. What about the opposite location that you think it should have totally done well, but it did poorly?
And so there's two things I would highlight here. So the first one is, so the location I'm thinking of is Walnut Street in Philadelphia. For those that don't know, that's like the premier shopping street in Philly. And the second thing I want to emphasize is like the definition of poorly, right? And I think there's two very correct but very different definitions. Success and failure to landlords and brokers tends to be dictated by how much are you driving in volume. But the part of it that a retailer should care the most about is, okay, yeah, I got the volume, but did I get the profit? Did I get the EBITDA or the net income? And so just because a place has high foot traffic and drives high volume does not mean it's actually going to be profitable for you. And I think Walnut Street, much like Fifth Avenue, much like Abbot Kinney, like all these high streets in these major metro areas that are seen as very sexy and super highly trafficked, the rents tend to be disproportionately higher than the volume opportunity. And so we cranked on volume there, but we did not do well on profitability because the rents were just so high. And I generally, my personal perspective is that high street retail just generally is not worth it. There's
Hmm.
always going to be exceptions, and I think luxury brands are one of a few buckets that generally make it work a little bit more. But if you're kind of a specialty retailer and you want that flagship presence, 9 out of 10 times you're probably going to lose money.
How do you how do you think about the argument on that Philadelphia store that it would raise your actual e-commerce sales by having a physical presence? Did you see any of that? Does that argument hold weight with you at all?
Absolutely. And I think there's definitely a benefit. It varies by and we saw this where it would vary by location. In some cases, there's actually the opposite of that. You open a store and the people who were shopping e-com are now just shopping in your store. So net net, you're draining your e-com presence in that particular market. And so if you're a D2C brand that's opening stores, strongly encourage you to measure the e-com business in that area, because what you're probably going to see is a J curve. Once you open, in the first, call it 3 to 6 months, I think for us it was like 6 to 8 months, you would see a little bit of a dip as all those e-com customers said, oh, why would I buy online? I'm going to buy in the store now. But then over a 2 year period, they go back to shopping online in apparel because they've been fitted. They now see a broader assortment. They're more willing to buy more expensive product, suiting for us in that example. And so they become much better e-com customers. And so overall, like I would say, depending on the time frame you're measuring, there is that halo effect that everybody talks about. But I'd say 50% of the time, you're actually going to drain your e-com channel for a short period of time in the beginning before those customers go back to e-com being better customers.
When you think about e-commerce or D2C versus just pure brick and mortar retail, is pretty much the only difference is the fact that e-commerce has online sales and everything else is the exact same, or is it more nuanced than that?
The nuance that I think is really fascinating that people don't often talk about is the how the economics of these channels work in terms of growth.
Yeah,
And
let's
so
talk about this. You get some great thoughts here.
yeah, and I'm oversimplifying, which I fully recognize, and I'm leaving out some nuances. But the way I like to describe it is if you imagine a graph, and on the x-axis, going from left to right, is number of customers you're acquiring, call it per month. And then on the y-axis is the incremental CAC, or the average CAC of all the new customers you're acquiring. Generally speaking, if you're throttling, like, okay, this month I'm typically acquiring 100 customers, now I'm going to spend a lot of marketing, so I acquire 200, your incremental CAC is going up. Because the way these digital platforms work is they're essentially auction-based platforms, and there's only a few key players, so you're bidding against everybody else in a very concentrated marketplace, right? Or a concentrated few marketplaces. So the more you're trying to grow in a concentrated period, in a fixed period of time, the more you're going to pay for that growth, and therefore the less profitable it's going to be. And then add on top of that, over time, ecom has had such a huge influx of players that the competition is getting enormous. You can start an ecom brand overnight. I built one on Shopify in like 6 hours just to see what it's like. And with stores, though, yes, there's an enormous fixed cost, and yes, there's a lot of risk because you're spending all this money, you're signing a lease, you're hiring all these people before you've even generated $1 of revenue. However, if you're growing, then the opposite is true relative to what happens in ecom. So your rent is 90% of the time it's a fixed cost, right? Like you're spending X amount of dollars a month, and your utilities and whatever else, even your staff, is generally pretty fixed. So as you're driving more revenue, you're spreading that fixed cost over a larger pool of customers. So your incremental CAC actually goes down as you grow. Now, if you're declining and you're a contracting brand, then you're kind of getting screwed because now it's accelerating back the other way. But the point I always try to make in terms of the unit economic difference is that brick and mortar and digital channels operate kind of opposite to each other in terms of what happens when you're trying to throttle growth. And if you think about what makes a good long-term brand, it's one that has diversification of engines, right? Like in the same way, you're not just going to put 100% of your savings into Bitcoin, right? You should probably diversify it a little bit. I like to think about growth engines the same way. You got some growth coming out of ecom, which it gets more expensive as you scale, and then some growth coming out of brick and mortar, which gets less expensive as you scale, so that your CAC kind of stays a little bit stable over time.
Yeah, I love that. It's just so different than how I think a lot of D2C brands are typically thinking about this. And I see the same thing because we have a number of segments, and then we can see which segments are being targeted, and I can tell you what it is. It's always the top 25% of income earners,
Yeah.
primarily. And it's like, oh, everyone is going and competing on that same audience because it's an auction for that audience, and that's just going to drive up cost for that. That's one of the reasons that I'm actually a big fan of direct mail, because it's pretty consistent costs, you know, all the
Yeah.
way through. You know what you're going to be paying for 63 cents
Right.
per postage thing, and it's kind of predictable too. So I really like the way that you're thinking about that, and we've kind of got into this, but what would you say if you were talking to a D2C brand that's thinking about that? What are the other arguments for doing this brick and mortar expansion strategy?
Yeah, I think and some of this depends on just where you are in your fundraising cycle. If you're fundraising even at all, I think VCs in particular who used to really prop up a lot of the e-com space, they're really not interested anymore. E-com is really challenging to grow in. And so as you're thinking about just what does your profile look like what does your actual pitch deck look like, e-com brands are a dime a dozen these days. And I think if you can prove that you know how to execute and scale brick and mortar, it shows just a lot more sophistication. And again, to my earlier point, it shows that you have a diversified growth engine. And I would say the same of, if you're e-com going into wholesale, that's awesome too. And if you're wholesale going to brick and mortar, that's like it almost doesn't really matter as long as you're showing and proving that you are able to diversify your channels and you're seeing the benefit of that on either your CAC or your LTVs.
How should, if you're a D2C brand, you don't have any brick and mortar stores, how do you go about forecasting what the ROI is on those brick and mortar stores?
Yeah, great question. It's the toughest part about all of this. If you've opened a few, you've got benchmarks, you've got frameworks, you have correlations and trend lines you can draw off of. If you're opening your first one, you really don't have anything. And so what I generally recommend is to say, build your pro forma model to say, here's what the P&L looks like, but leave the revenue line blank, and then just plug it. What does it need to be for this business case to make sense for you based on whatever your financial criteria is? In many cases, that criteria is a payback period of 2 years or less, sometimes less than that. Sometimes it's a 5-year IRR, like whatever your criteria is, plug the revenue number to determine what is what you must believe in, and then break that number apart. Say, okay, we know our e-com cart size, our AOV is X amount of dollars. Based on that, and we know that we've got 1,000 square foot space, and based on the other tenants here and based on tools like what you've got and what the other GIS platforms show, like this is what we can expect for traffic. And then you kind of back into then, okay, well, what must my conversion rate be?
Hmm.
And is this mix of variables crazy? Because what you really need to solve for, AOV between online and offline, it's certainly not the same, and depending on what your free shipping limitations are and things like that, there can be some drastic differences. But generally speaking, you at least have some anchoring point to say, my cart size online is $100, so therefore in store, it's a pretty safe assumption. It's going to be wrong, but it's a fair benchmark to say my in-store cart size is $100. And then you play with traffic and conversion to say, okay, for me to hit this revenue number to make this business case work, I need to have 1,000 footsteps a week and convert them at 50%. Good luck. And I think that's where talking to an expert or a friend or an advisor or consultant, whoever, to say, does this matrix of cart size times conversion times traffic make sense, or am I signing up for something crazy? And you kind of just got to take that leap of faith.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine gave a really good analogy that opening brick and mortar is like you're jumping off a cliff before you can see what the landing looks like. And unfortunately, that's just how it is.
Yeah. So it's like the costs are generally known, as I'm hearing you talk about this, and you put that into your P&L, and then you got four variables. It sounds like one is what your own AOV is. That's it's about as good as we're gonna get there. The other is what is the traffic at that store. So that could be done with mobile location data. Could be
Mhm.
counters is probably a great way to do it. It's like if it's like a mall and we know how many people are walking in, and then essentially like, the one thing I've heard you talk about is ask the landlord to see what the other tenant's doing and see if the landlord will give you some of that information that's helpful. And but then it's like then you got to kind of guesstimate on what your conversion is and does it meet those criteria. That's really good. That's a really good exercise.
At the end of the day, it's just a math equation, right? And so you've got the number you got to hit, and now it's just a matter of playing with three variables, one of which you know, and just determining what's the right combination and what's actually feasible.
Cool. Well, let's. I like to lay a little bit of groundwork here, and we've touched on a few of these things. But if you have a D2C brand that comes to you, and they're at the beginning of this, they've got really good online metrics, and they're thinking about going this brick and mortar route. What is the step by step process? Maybe at a high level, because I know you have a lot of thoughts on these that you take them through to go from all right, I don't know anything about this strategy to I'm ready to execute on my first market, my first store.
Yeah, yeah. So I generally like to start with just a conversation to understand like why do you want to do this? Is it because you're trying to generate cash in the next 12 months? Or is it because you're trying to build a long-term business? Or, what is your actual motivation here? Because the challenge that I've seen time and time again is that a lot of e-com brands, when they think about brick and mortar, they're assuming that they're going to get the same ROI in terms of in a time frame as they do on digital channels. You could spend $50 today, get $100 tomorrow in digital, right? It doesn't work like that with brick and mortar. And so I think it's very important to level set. This is how long the process takes. Here's how much money it's probably going to cost you. And here's how long it's going to take before you actually see a profit or, your cash paid back. And again, 2 years is like a pretty solid benchmark and a pretty successful one if you can pull that off. I like to start with just general education and understanding the why. And then in terms of the actual process, the next natural question is always, all right, where should we go?
Yeah.
So what I like to start with there is just I'll get a transaction log just showing all the order data going back the last 2 years and the shipping address so that I can geocode it, throw it into a map, and also tabularize it so I can show them visually. Here's where people are clustered in New York City, for example. You've got a big concentration in Soho. You don't really have much in Brooklyn, so throw that aside. And just giving a general ballpark sense of like where their customers are, and then doing a couple tabular outputs to show what markets, is New York even the right market, or is it LA, or is it Chicago, whatever. And I always like to start tops down to say, here's the markets that are of most interest based on your ecom business. Here's where the pockets are within the market. And
Hmm.
then comes the part where you start building up your vendor network to say, okay, here's where we want to be. We've built our business case. We've built the pro forma. Now let's go talk to brokers to figure out what deal terms look like. Is there even anything available? And then from there, it just becomes, and I'm going to fast forward through this, is just the natural process of designing your space, hiring a GC to actually build it or build whatever components you need. And over that time, pretty much from finding your site to then going through design and construction is when there's kind of a race to say, okay, let's get the team built. Let's build the SOPs. Let's figure out what the right merchandising is for all of this. And depending on whether you're doing a pop-up, depending on whether a space is available in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, that may change kind of the sequencing, but that's generally how I like to approach it. It's gonna be chaotic no matter what way you do it for the first time, and no matter which way you approach it, it's gonna feel terrible. It always does. When you think about it, opening your first store is literally starting a whole new company, right? Like you've got, in some cases, a whole new legal entity. I don't recommend that, by the way. But you've got a whole staff. You have new training and policies. You have merchandising. Like, there's just so many aspects that go into it that it's not a small undertaking.
So let's go a little bit deeper into that market selection. Is it just as simple as map that e-commerce data, find the CBSA that it's in, and then choose a CBSA? Or are you looking other things? Are you looking like retail nodes in that area? Are you looking at the demographics of the area? What other characteristics are you taking into account?
Yeah, I tend to like to oversimplify it by saying let's just look at the ecom data, because when you think about if you think about ecom data as almost like a math equation, it's like population plus brand awareness equals ecom sales. So it's like, yes, you could look at population and demographics and measure brand awareness and all this stuff, but why bother measuring all those independent variables when you could just measure the dependent variable
Mhm.
and shortcut your way there? Now, that said, I always do supplement the view with, okay, who are your cross-shopped brands? Who are your competitors? Where are they? And there's a lot of different resources out there that you can leverage to also say, okay, for us as Bonobos, it's like, where are all the J. Crews? Where are all the Brooks Brothers? And all of those kind of comps. How many do they have in each CBSA? And where within the CBSA are they located? And so in a perfect world, you find a place in your top CBSA in a really dense pocket of your ecom customers, right by all of your friends. And I know a lot of folks, depending on the brand, are like, I don't want to be by my competition. They're going to crush me, blah, blah, blah. I view it as like, if you really believe in your product or even just your pricing, then you should absolutely ride the coattails of your competitors. We tried in a lot of cases at Bonobos to try to be the cool kid on the block and go to this cool side street. And there are definitely cases where that's the right thing to do. But there were some cases where we really forced it. And I always like to, a colleague used to always describe it as it's cool versus commerce, right? You can go to the cool block, but that's not where the business is being made, right? Like Abbot Kinney, it's a really cool street. Apparel brands do not make money there. They get crushed there time and time again. If you're F&B, different story. But I like to look at it a bunch of different dimensions, but I always kind of anchor to here's what the data says.
Okay, so you use the e-commerce data, you find that pocket, and then you're basically looking at competitors or synergistic brands. At what point do you determine, like, all right, we actually think this market is saturated with this type of product?
I don't even think about saturation, and even Bonobos that was hundreds of millions in revenue. I didn't think about saturation for the category. And a really good example of that is what is it called? Tyson's Galleria in DC has a ton of menswear brands all concentrated in a single corridor, and that had it was a full checklist of like every menswear brand we wanted to see was there. And that to me is not like, oh, this is fully saturated with menswear. In my mind, it was like a lot of these brands are legacy. They're going away. There's a lot of business to be had, even if they weren't. I'm not worried about that. Now, saturation of our own store footprint is a different conversation. I think generally speaking, that's where understanding trade area data and isochrones and how the dynamics of that look becomes really important. And when you're doubling, tripling, quadrupling down in a market, and that becomes a literal puzzle where you can kind of see like, okay, the 15-minute drive time around stores A, B, and C look like this. We want to make sure they're spaced enough apart that they're not totally overlapping, but not so spaced apart that we're leaving all this white space in between, and not getting some synergies on marketing costs, for example. So
That's an
two
interesting
very
point.
different, yeah, two different kind of buckets of considerations for
Well,
saturation.
well, now we're getting into two different Andrews or two different eras of Andrew
Yeah.
in Bonobos. Because I mean, how many locations is Bonobos did they eventually get before you left?
I left, I believe, right around 70.
Okay.
We had a few more signed leases, but I left in 2020, and one of my final projects was here are the leases I think we got to try to get out of. And so I know there was some rationalization of the footprint right after I left. So I don't know where they stand today, but yeah, I left around 70, I believe.
Once you hit 50, how does this analysis change? Because this seems very simple and pretty wide open if you have none. But now we're getting into some like cannibalization, overlap. What changes?
Yeah, super good question. So what and I wrote about this a while ago, and I have a really cool graphic that kind of shows this, where basically there's phases to a store development program among this cohort of D2C brands who have stores. What usually happens is, and I'm oversimplifying, but like your first 10 to 15 stores, um, it's easy to say, okay, I'm just going to do one store per market. I'm not going to double down because there's a lot of white space out there. Um, but then at a certain point, once you get to market, if you imagine like a list of your CBSAs and how much ecom business you have, you'll eventually get to a point where, call it market number 16, the value of a store there is going to be less than the incremental value of a second store in your first ranked CBSA.
Okay, yeah.
And that's where things start getting a bit more complex, because now you have to start measuring, to your point, cannibalization. You have to dilute a little bit of whatever halo effect you were underwriting for the first one, because the halo effect's already there.
Hmm.
But then there's nuances, right? Like if you're opening in New York, for example, and you have one on the Upper West Side, if you open one in Soho, you're probably fine. There's not much cannibalization to be worried about there. But if you're talking about, uh, you know, Boston, for example, and you're on Newbury Street, then opening in Prudential Center, now you got to talk about cannibalization. But you also get some of the benefit of operational synergies. So the business case, I would say that the most complexity just comes into measuring the incremental impact. So if store number 2 in a market does $2 million, you're cannibalizing, making it up, call it 100,000 of that. So you really should only be underwriting the incremental part. But you also get to give yourself, assuming you operate this way, a little bit of the benefit of synergistic operations if you're sharing a manager, for example, or you're sharing inventory, or I don't know, whatever you might be doing on the back end. So the business case gets really complex, and the way that I like to think about it is you kind of, when you think about modeling out store number 1, you're really modeling what is the incremental cash flow from making this decision today. If I make the decision, my cash flow does this. If I don't make the decision, my cash flow stays at 0, right? So your baseline status quo it's 0, it's non-existent. When you're opening a new store or your second store in an existing market, your status quo is not 0. So you almost have to model out, like, what is this hypothetical, completely made up business case of what is this other store going to do if I don't open a second one and cannibalize it? And then what is that one going to do on top of, or netted against what my new location is going to do, to make sure you're just looking at the incrementality. So the modeling just gets a little bit more sophisticated, but it's kind of the same logic, the same framework. It's still looking within a market to say, all right, well, I filled the first most dense e-commerce pocket in New York. Where's the second one? And where's the second one that is also just enough out of reach that it's not cannibalizing the first one? And more importantly, what I think people forget is there a deal available at the price that I want in the space size that I want? And that's always the limiting factor. You could make the theoretical playbook and white space sequencing however you want, but the reality is, especially these days, the real estate's just not necessarily available.
Let's talk a little bit about that. And I think I want to talk about this from a store rationalization point of view, because what I'm curious about is you've got basically your model, and you know how to open up stores, and you know generally what they'll do. Like, you get comfortable with that. But then there's these other factors, like there's cost to these stores. I want to know about the bogeymans that people aren't thinking about when it comes to signing a deal, signing a lease, thinking about labor that ends up affecting the stores in a way that you were like, we need to close that. How do you think about, what metrics are you looking at when you're trying to consolidate a portfolio of stores? And then what are some of those things that people aren't thinking about that are driving up costs or creating problems?
Yeah, great question. I think you can always point to, the store teams are spending too much money on office supplies and employee parties and events and things like that, and there's some dollars there, and you need cost controls. to your earlier question of like once you get to a certain level of stores and you start scaling, how does that playbook change? That's where the boring stuff comes in to say, okay, if one store is overspending on supplies, it's not really a big enough problem to be for anyone for it to be worth anybody's time to go fix. But once you get to like 20 to 40, you got to start focusing on those because it adds up. But that alone is not really how, like, that's the easy go to is like, where's the G&A? Where can we cut it? The one that tends to be the first target all the time is where can we cut staffing cost before even getting to the closing decision. And that's where a lot of management teams will say, oh, our staffing has totally ballooned. We got to trim it down. And what they're not necessarily considering is the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that has. If you start getting rid of employees, you don't have people serving customers. You have a crappy experience for the customer and a crappy experience for the employee. Crappy experience for the employee makes an even worse experience for the customer. It just becomes this downward spiral. And so I think that when you're kind of thinking about store rationalization, people love going to the cost cutting instead of first, how can we actually get better business driven to the stores? And I feel like that should be kind of frontier one. And when you get to the point of, okay, now we got to start cost cutting, labor is it's the go-to for whatever reason. Businesses love honing in on what is my payroll as a percent of sales, and it's got to stay at some number. It can never increase. And while I generally agree with the directionality of that, it's a very delicate game to play because, again, the self-fulfilling prophecy part of it. Now, in terms of like the bogeys and like what to look out for, and it's a little bit of a nuance, but the bogey is really an accounting implication. So for those that are not familiar, rent is the GAAP accounting rules of rent is very different than how you actually pay cash rent. So the way that GAAP accounting makes you pay rent or expense rent is take rent over the life of the lease, and then you pay or expense the same amount of rent every single year, pretty much. But in reality, your cash rent is going up, right? I say it's a little bit of a bogey because from a cash perspective, depending on who's looking at the P&L, who you'd be surprised, a lot of folks who are, I'd say, stores 0 to 50 are not super savvy in lease accounting. They'll look at a P&L and say, oh, things look fine, because the rent expense is that same average fixed number for GAAP accounting, but you're actually about to hit some massive cash rent escalation in year 6, for example. And now
I'm not fully understanding how that works because I've never signed a lease on a a retail property. How does that work?
So super high level, a common way that a lease can be structured is, and I'm making this up, you pay $50 for years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then in year 6, your rent jumps up to $75, and then it's $75 for year 6 through year 10. The way GAAP accounting expenses your rent, let's say the average of that, I'm oversimplifying, is $60. The way GAAP accounting expenses your rent is $60 a year for 10 years. You never see it go up. And so the bogey in this case is not knowing that going from year 5 to year 6, you've got a 50% increase in rent, going from $50 to $75. But if you're just looking at the GAAP accounting P&L, it looks flat. Now that's obviously problematic when that means that you're overestimating the profitability of that location on a cash basis. So now all of a sudden going from year 5 to year 6, you're getting hit with a massive rent escalation. And that's something that is very nuanced. It's very, I wouldn't say it's like the make or break thing necessarily, but it's one that I think often catches people by surprise because they've just been modeling out this GAAP rent expense. That's just, it's an accounting mechanism, but that's not how you're actually paying the cash.
What other factors do you consider once you've found a site, you feel good about it, before actually signing that lease? What are the things that you're looking at about that site?
I'd say from a qualitative standpoint, a couple things, and this doesn't necessarily make or break it, but is just operationally really good to know, is operating hours, number one. So, a lot of brands who are kind of new to this, they'll say, well, we just have a GM and X amount of people, and that's our staff. We're going to copy paste it. But if you're running a store, in Soho, for example, you're maybe running 55 to 60 hours a week. But if you open in a mall, they mandate that you operate essentially anywhere from 72 to 78 hours a week. That's a massive difference in the amount of hours that you have to be open, and therefore the amount of labor you need to have coverage. So that's one that, again, doesn't necessarily make or break a deal in and of itself, but it may make or break your financial model, because now you have to have so much more labor built in, such that, whether it's your labor as a percent of sales is now much higher than it typically is, or whether that alone just breaks the model because you just can't afford that much labor. That's a pretty big one to keep in mind, and is one of the reasons why I don't like malls. I think they are, I would say, a way that people shop, and you kind of just got to deal with it in certain parts of the country, but they are objectively a much higher cost basis for similar amounts of revenue as you would get on a street location. So that's a hugely important one. And then the other one is, and again, not necessarily a make or break, but just how challenging a building department in that municipality might be. Getting a permit in certain counties or certain states just broadly can be extremely, extremely challenging. And if you're opening in kind of a historic area like certain parts of Manhattan, not only do you have to go through the building department to get that permit, but you might have to go through a landmarks committee or even a co-op board. There's all these other hoops you got to jump through, and that's where I would look to a broker to help you navigate and understand, like, what are these things that I should know before signing this? Not because it'll kill the deal, but just to set expectations realistically.
Have you ever done any pop-up shops? I don't know if Bonobos does those.
Yeah, we kind of did one at Bonobos. I say pop-up because it was an 18-month deal, and then we did them a lot at Interior Define.
Okay.
Where we kind of did we would open a pop once we signed a full lease. That's going to take 6 to 12 months before it actually opens, because we have to build it out and get permits and blah blah blah. So once we signed a lease, we would then say, okay, let's go open a pop-up to kind of start revving the market a little bit, training the staff, and kind of seed the market before the real one opened. And so those are an enormous amount of work. I think people who have been through this and have scaled channels a lot will probably tell you, like, pop-ups are just a waste of time. I don't fully subscribe to that, but I would say that they are a disproportionate amount of work to get done in a super crunched amount of time, and usually with not super great results, because if you think about it, and again, always goes back to the store staff, like, if I go hire a GM and say, yeah, you've got a 6-month job, you're not going to end up with the best GM. They're not interested. The best GMs are not interested in a 6-month pop-up. So there's a lot of level setting of expectations that need to happen. And assuming it's a success, you'll really, really regret not having just done a real deal. But at the same token, like, if it ends up totally bombing, then yeah, probably good you just did a pop-up.
Well, how do you think of them as an evaluation tool? The way you're talking about them feels like that's it's very expensive, hard way to do an evaluation.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because I think this kind of goes back to what I had mentioned in the very beginning of, like, understanding the why, right? And I think when people open a pop-up, a lot of times they're opening it with the expectation that they will either break even or make money on a 6-month window, right? But again, if you go back to, like, what is a pretty universally accepted payback period, it's 24 months. So objectively, you're not out of that J-curve dip yet. That you're still net out money. And then all of a sudden, the brand is like, oh, we're 6 months in and this didn't work. We didn't make cash. Terrible idea. Retail doesn't work. When in reality, they just didn't give it the time that it actually needs. And so what I like to get out of a pop-up is just, what is the revenue potential? Because that will translate-ish from a pop-up to a real store. But I wouldn't necessarily look at the ROI, essentially, which sounds kind of crazy to say. Because in a pop-up with a 6-month window, you're just not going to get that ROI. And if you do, heck yeah, like do a lot more, or grow up into doing the real stores. But I think if you're using it to try to make cash and you're doing it for a less than 12-month period and you're trying to measure profitability even, you're measuring the wrong things. And the other thing I like pop-ups for is just the training and the seeding of the market, letting people know you're there, and then getting staff who are new to kind of practice selling in a lower risk environment versus when you open your real store. From that month onwards is when investors are looking, when the finance team is looking, and usually it takes 3 months for an employee to ramp. But if you got that 3 months out of the way at a pop-up that nobody's really caring about, then that's great. Now you're hitting the ground running and your metrics
Yeah.
look a lot better. So I think there are pros to it. I'm not anti pop-up, but I think people just need to really understand like what the purpose of it should be, and at least what not to expect out of it.
What what is the marketing checklist once you have actually opened up a real store? Is there a playbook there?
Yeah, and I would say the marketing checklist starts well before the store is opened. And so we started getting pretty good at this at Bonobos, where in the, I can't remember, but call it 1 to 3 months before opening. Bonobos was great in that they were present in every single channel, right? They had wholesale, they had catalogs, they had mailers, they did some billboards and other out of home. And so once we had a signed lease and we knew kind of roughly when a store was going to open, then the marketing team would start kind of seeding the market a little bit by putting in the catalogs like new store coming soon, like letting people know that there's something coming versus waiting till day one when it's open. And again, now you got to ramp all the way from zero on day one instead of having started that ramp before even opening. So I think the pre-opening marketing is absolutely critical. And then continuing to nurture the store. I think the biggest fallacy, in my opinion, about brick and mortar retail is the store is the marketing. You don't need to do marketing, which if you're opening, 50,000 square foot anchor type locations, sure. Like a Restoration Hardware mansion, 100% that's marketing. But when you're a 2,000 square foot inline space, it's not marketing. You need to tell people you're there and you need to drive that traffic there. Because especially these days, people walking by, they're on their phones, they're not paying attention. There's too much other stimulus. So I'd say I'm not a marketer, but I would say that it's I've seen time and time again that you still need marketing.
Yeah, and then to start early on it.
Mm.
Um, I'm wondering if there's any standard ways of thinking about retail site selection in the industry that you would just outright disagree with.
Mm. Yeah, quite a few. And I would say the most, I would say, widespread, although this is changing now that there's a lot of tools like yours or like Placer out there, it's beginning to change. But the kind of two frameworks that people have historically used and still a lot used today, whether they're on the tenant side or on the broker side pitching or on the landlord side marketing, is using just basic demographics to say there's 2 times the population in this 10-mile radius as there are in that 10-mile radius. So you should expect 2 times the volume, which I've looked in all of these D2C brands, there's very little correlation between single variable demographics and actual store performance for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is like just because you are of a certain income or a certain education, that doesn't mean that you're a customer of X, Y, and Z. Because your brand awareness, if nothing else, is not there, right? So that's kind of piece one, is just using basic demographics. I've loved, again, first party e-com data is the best, and then secondarily like segmentation data where it's the combinations of demographics, like how many households above a certain income, of a certain education, how many of those exist. That is extremely powerful. That's where things are beginning to go, I'd say, in the last couple of years, but people still aren't all quite there. And then the other kind of piece is just what people determine a trade area. And I mean that in a couple different ways. Like the academic definition of a trade area is like the geographic region from which you draw 80 to 90% of your sales. So call it 85%. It's not 10-mile radius, right? Like
Yeah.
10-mile radius in Miami, it's going to be very different than a 10-mile radius in
Yep.
Kansas City. And so I think there's just a general incorrect view and framework and lens of using a radius versus, and I mentioned it before, but an isochrone, like 15-minute drive time. And there are a bunch of different ways to measure, okay, what is the average drive time that captures 85% of my sales across all my stores? And it's going to differ. Like a mall has a different drive time isochrone for 85% of a business than that of a street location. And so, for example, at Bonobos, the average drive time that captured 85% of the business was like something like 20 minutes. But for a mall, it was like 35 or 40 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are notably different dynamics between store format types and just across locations in general. And so I think when a developer or a landlord or a broker puts a book in front of me and is like, here's the demographics, the single variable demographics in a 10-mile radius, I literally just throw it out. It's just not useful. And so I think with the new tools that are out there today, I think there should be, and there's a little bit of an evolution towards these more sophisticated and I would say more accurate approaches to site selection.
Yeah, I totally ground with you on that. I think mobile location data is really opening people's eyes to true trade areas. I think people misunderstand the estimations. They're not supposed to be accurate. And people are like, these aren't accurate. Well, no, they're not, because they're based on maybe like 5% sample. They're directionally accurate, and they're a decent way of ranking things. And then the other piece where you're talking about segmentation, I'm all in on that one. And I'm curious, where does segmentation play a role in your process? Because a lot of segmentation still is leveraging the demographics, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, I like to start by kind of reverse engineering to say, everybody thinks they know who their brand's demographics are, and the reality is they don't. They know maybe the most dominant segment, but that only accounts for, at least from what I've seen, that may only account for, call it 50 to 60% of your customer base. But then there's kind of this medium to long tail of all these other buckets. And how that demographic mix is comprised will vary by geography, right? Like your demographic mix in Boston is going to look different than it might be in like Tucson versus Baltimore. Like they're all going to be a little bit different. And I think it's really important to kind of reverse engineer to say, before even saying these are the demographics I want to go for, where are they? To start with, who are my demographics or who are my segments, and how does that vary by CBSA, which is the lens I like to use. And then instead of just saying we want to target the demographic mix that is representative of our national average, that's not going to do you any good. You got to understand what is that mix at the CBSA level and then find those pockets. And so there's a lot of tools like yours where brands can use them to understand who is my actual customer base. Okay, now where are those people within those CBSAs? So yeah, there's a lot of fascinating work and a lot of surprises that I've had working with brands, showing like, here's who you think your customer base is, and you might be right on a national level, but when you look at certain individual markets, you are wildly wrong.
Yep. Man, Andrew, I've loved talking to you. I love the stuff that you are doing at OneRec, and I love your tenacity around the math portion of this, because you look deeply and you think creatively about it, and it's cool to see the creativity and the math come together. If people were going to find out more about you or OneRec, what do they need to do? Where do they need to go?
Yeah, either check out onerec.co or clickstobricksplaybook.com, which is where I do a lot of deep dives on the strategies and tactics, and start sharing a lot of new announcements that'll be coming up soon.
All right, rock on. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Leiden.